Vietnam was considered a colony of the French Empire. But after the defeat of the French in Europe in 1940, the Japanese came in and they occupying the whole territory of Vietnam.
My first memory is of bombing. The Japanese, when they took over Nam Dinh, we ran and hid in the shelter, and when we came out, a bullet grazed the forehead of the woman who was carrying me. The blood trickled down on me. When we got home and turned on the lights, my parents thought I had been shot because I was covered with blood.
There was a question what the international powers would do for Vietnam. President Roosevelt at that time had the idea of giving a temporary status for Vietnam.
This document from FDR to Cordell Hull in early 1944, I think, speaks to the president's low opinion of what the French had done in Indochina. I think it speaks to what I think is a powerful theme, namely his belief that America risked being on the wrong side of history if it supported a French return. Franklin Roosevelt died. The French did show a determination to come back into Indochina. Harry Truman, he just didn't feel as strongly about this, and in effect did not stand in the way of this French return, which really gains steam in 1945, precisely at the moment that Ho Chi Minh is also embarking on a path to achieve independence for his country.
When the communists took the power in 1945, they tried to destroy all the nationalists. They arrest the nationalists, they kidnap the nationalists, they kill the nationalists when they can. And that is the beginning of the war between nationalists and communists. And so we are not happy with the arrival of the communists to power, but we are in bad shape by then.
So the OSS in 1945 became very involved in working to defeat the Japanese, who had taken control of Indochina early in the war, and they worked alongside the Viet Minh, which was Ho Chi Minh's revolutionary organization. Archimedes Paddy is one of the OSS agents, and like, to my knowledge, every single one of them, of the OSS people, he was impressed by Ho Chi Minh. He liked him. And he pens this cable on September 2nd, 1945, precisely the moment when Ho, in Hanoi, declares independence. Borrowing, by the way, from the American Declaration of Independence in a kind of naked play for support from Washington. Paddy basically says, we should work with this guy. And in effect, Paddy is saying we make a mistake if we choose instead to side with the French. Most officials said, this guy is a communist, therefore we cannot work with him, and because we also need French support in Europe, which is key to prevent communism from triumphing in France, we should also work with the French in Indochina.
Two of my brothers were actually at Ba Dinh Square when Ho Chi Minh declared independence. They were very excited because they were just carried along by the psychology of the crowd. We were finally free from French domination. My father was ambivalent. He was happy that we had independence, but he was very afraid of the Viet Minh because he knew they were communists, or they had a program to transform Vietnamese society.
What Ho Chi Minh proceeded to do is to send a series of letters to President Truman, hoping for American support, because he believed that America could be his ally. And what's powerful about this is the degree to which he held this conviction. It's not really until the late 1940s that he finally says, guess I can't count on the Americans.
My oldest sister, Thang, had no ambivalence whatsoever. She and her husband were supporters of the Viet Minh. Not only would the Viet Minh liberate Vietnam from French domination, but the Viet Minh would also transform society in a way that the poor and the oppressed people would be liberated as well. In fact, she and her husband left the French zone to go into the mountains to live under the Viet Minh. One time there were a French convoy passing through Hanoi, and my father said, well, look at them, they're so strong. How are you going to defeat them? She said, don't be fooled. They might look strong, but they don't have the support of the people. We'll win. In 1954, the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, and Vietnam was divided in two, with Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh taking over the northern part down to the 17th parallel, and the French retaining the south from the 17th parallel downward.
So I arrived on August the 8th, 1954, 2 days before my 25th birthday. The Geneva Accords had occurred, the country was being divided in two, and the South was really in chaos.
When we moved to Saigon, we had no housing, my father had no job, and we were not the only refugees for North Vietnam. There were something like 800,000 to 1 million refugees from the North who had fled communism or the Viet Minh to move south, and a lot of them, the majority of them, were Catholics.
There were lots of planes flying up empty and then bringing refugees back, so I just took one of those flights. And I noticed a group of refugees standing on one side of the apron, obviously waiting for a flight. And so I started asking, why were they fleeing? And out of the crowd, in almost a chorus, was, we're afraid that the communists will kill us.
Dwight Eisenhower and his administration make a decision, in a sense, to try to succeed where the French have failed. So they're going to create a non-communist bastion in the southern part of Vietnam in order to preserve at least part of Indochina from succumbing to communism.
I tell them, we will help you. What else could I say? That became part of my motivation for becoming so involved with the Vietnamese. And I like to explain that in a way of saying that I felt I became sort of a brother of the Vietnamese who wanted to keep what remained of their country free.
So the domino theory, which Dwight Eisenhower articulated famously at a press conference in April of 1954, is a theory that argues that if one country falls, if one domino falls to communism, then all the other countries in that area will also topple.
You have a row of dominoes set up and you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is certainly that it'll go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences.
I'll never forget my surprise in seeing in Russian archives the Chinese explaining the domino theory to the Russians as a way of arguing why Hanoi should be supported. Both sides believed in the fragility of these new states.
Ngo Dinh Diem was a Catholic from central Vietnam. He has a reputation throughout Vietnam as being a very nationalist and anti-French figure. One of the enduring myths about Ngo Dinh Diem is that he was installed in power in 1954 as Prime Minister of South Vietnam by the United States. Diem was certainly aware that the communists and his other critics referred to his government as Mỹ Diem, which in Vietnamese means America's Diem. And he really chafed against this. He took steps to try to demonstrate that he was not going to do Washington's bidding.
The National Army was in disarray. There were a couple of other religious sects who had armies who were also sort of vying for power. So almost immediately, plotting started in with the Army Chief of Staff to overthrow Diem.
Diem believed that he could defeat these rivals and consolidate his authority on his own. He provoked a showdown with some of the rival groups in the spring of 1955. He defeated them in the Battle of Saigon, and he went on to establish his authority over most of South Vietnam's territory.
And he was greeted by enormous and very happy crowds. because the word had gone out that, in effect, he was getting independence for the South as well as the North. The most optimistic moment in Vietnam was in 1956, when the Republic had been declared, when a Constitution had been adopted, when the National Assembly was elected. They had parades, the people walking out in the streets. I mean, there was just an air of happiness. It sort of gave me a deep sense of satisfaction about all the work that we had been involved in with the Vietnamese to get to that point, given all the difficulties that they faced at the very beginning, right after Geneva. It was some kind of miracle that South Vietnam even survived.
Basically, the United States was feeding us and clothing us and protecting us with an army and giving us a functioning government. So the United States in a way, succeeded in nation building. Of course, this was interrupted by the insurgency of the Viet Cong. But at the beginning, it was successful.
John F. Kennedy is really interesting on the Vietnam story. He had a better understanding than probably anybody else at the top level of American decision-making about the obstacles that stood in the way of any kind of success in Vietnam. Because what he says is, in effect, any Western power that seeks to defeat this revolution by military means is destined to lose. But there's a paradox, because that same Kennedy expands American involvement substantially.
We were hoping that the United States would stay and defend Vietnam, but of course in the back of our minds there was always a fear that it might not stick around, like the French. But Kennedy certainly reassured us that that was not going to happen. And of course in Vietnam he was beginning to up the ante. He was sending more equipment, more arms, more advisors.
To children, to us, we just like, oh, you see the ghost, right? You see the alien coming from other planet. To me, I just stood there because I couldn't run. Where would you run? They're making so much noise and the wind.
The Viet Cong had taken control of substantial portions of the South Vietnamese countryside by 1961. And it was clear that Diem's government was really back on its heels.
As the children, we never used the word Viet Cong. The Viet Cong is somebody we call uncles, auntie, and we call them liberation troop. Liberation troop grow in the village with us. From Viet Minh at first, Viet Minh who fought against the French.
President Diem, he and his family ruled the country at their whims, really. They were authoritarian. They suppressed any opposition.
People like my teachers and many other leadership in the village started to disappear. So people like my family and myself, we had to get ready for the war.
After the French Indochina War, there was a period of time in which the faction that was in control in Hanoi wanted to focus on rebuilding their country. The insurgents, the revolutionaries in the South, couldn't wait for Hanoi, for Party Center, to give them the green light to take up arms. I mean, they were being decimated as a result of Nguyen Diem's policies.
My family was dissatisfied with Diem from the beginning. The dissatisfaction grew when he began to crack down on the Buddhists. A lot of people who were unhappy with Diem, the people, the students, kind of rallied behind the Buddhists for their own reasons. So the Buddhists became like the spear carriers for this movement to depose Diem. So of course Diem and his family cracked down really hard, and a monk burned himself in protest. The Buddhist crisis was the beginning of the end for Diem and his family.
As the summer months go by in 1963, American officials, both in Washington and in Saigon, become increasingly distraught. They basically say to one another, we're not going to win this thing with Diem in power.
I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government to win popular support, that the war can be won out there. In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it.
The Hillsman Cable was a secret telegram that was drafted on August 24th, 1963. It was drafted mainly by the Undersecretary for East Asian Affairs, Roger Hillsman, with the help of some other State Department officials. And it was sent specifically to the newly arrived ambassador in South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge. The telegram authorized Lodge to open communications with commanders of the South Vietnamese Army, who at that time were known to be plotting a coup against Ngo Dinh Diem.
I went to see Diem, and he asked me, he said, "Do you think there's going to be a coup?" And I didn't feel like I could lie to him. And I didn't know the details, but I knew that it was certainly in the air. I said it was possible. On the day of the coup, he chooses to tell Lodge that I will accept President Kennedy's recommendations. Basically, he's saying he'll do whatever we want, but it came too late.
So the coup against the Diem government began in the early afternoon of November 1st, 1963. Diem made the decision to place a phone call to the U.S. Embassy to speak to the American ambassador. Lodge pretended not to know what was going on. He also suggested that perhaps the time had come for Diem to leave the country. Diem refused to do this, and he responded instead by saying that he had always done what duty and good sense require, and that he believes in duty above all else.
After the coup, I went to the palace with a friend, and we went to the sitting room where we had sat, and there was the sofa that I had sat on, and it was riddled with bullet holes.
In November of 1963 was the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem and Ngo Dinh Nhu, and then a few weeks later, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. This was when the North Vietnamese would attempt to win the war outright, topple the Saigon regime, and basically present the United States with a fait accompli so that it wouldn't deepen its involvement and transition to military intervention.
In the early part of 1964, Johnson, I think, is getting frustrated. The war is not going particularly well. Even with lots of U.S. support, the South Vietnamese military is steadily losing more ground. And I think he's decided, Johnson, from the day he comes into power after Kennedy's assassination, that he will not be the president who lost Vietnam. So when he has this conversation with Robert McNamara, who's really his most important, I think, Vietnam advisor, what's notable for me is the degree to which Johnson wants to see more.
What I want is somebody that can lay up some plans to trap these guys and whoop hell out of them, kill some of them. That's what I want to do.
I think it underscores this notion of a fundamentally hawkish Lyndon Johnson. This notion that became very popular later, which is that Americans were ignorant of Vietnam, didn't know what they were doing. They had this hubris, this exaggerated self-confidence that led them to stumble into this thing. I don't think it's true. The conversation with McGeorge Bundy in May is so interesting to me. Johnson here is in, I think it's fair to say, despair about the war.
And the more I think of it, I don't know what in the hell. It looks like me we're getting into another Korea. It just worries the hell out of me. I don't see what we can ever hope to get out of there with once we're committed. I believe the Chinese communists coming into it. I don't think that we can fight them 10,000 miles away from home and ever get anywhere in that area. I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out.
What he's conscious of is that he is about to commit young men to fight in this war. And he's doing so even while he also harbors these doubts about whether it's worth it.
One thing that is Vietnam worth to me? What is Laos worth to me? What is it worth to this country?
I think that the Johnson administration entered the month of August 1964 looking for a pretext to be able to flex American muscle.
There was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin where an American ship was somehow attacked by the communists in North Vietnam.
Earlier in 1964, the United States launches covert raids against North Vietnam, involving also the South Vietnamese, to be sure, but they're really an American creation.
And I think I should also, or we should also at that time, Mr. President, explain this Op Plan 34A, these covert operations. There's no question but what that had bearing on it. And Friday night, as you probably know, we had 4 TP boats from Vietnam, manned by Vietnamese or other nationals, attacked 2 islands.
Those raids clearly influenced the North Vietnamese to launch the initial attack against an American destroyer on the 2nd of August.
And we expended 1,000 rounds of ammunition of one kind or another against them. We probably shot up a radar station and a few other miscellaneous buildings. And following 24 hours after that with this destroyer in that same area undoubtedly led them to connect the 2 events.
And they portrayed this as being unprovoked.
Earlier tonight, the President told the nation the United States would take appropriate action to respond to the unprovoked attacks on U.S. naval vessels by torpedo boats of North Vietnam.
I think we have pretty good evidence now that there was an attack on August 2nd, but that there was not a second attack on August 4th, as the administration alleged, and it was in response to this alleged second attack on the 4th that Johnson ordered retaliatory airstrikes against selected targets within North Vietnam.
I was very, very impressed by the kind of resolute attitude from the American Congress for giving President Johnson the full power to intervene military in Vietnam.
He gets, in the aftermath of this set of strikes, a congressional resolution giving the president, as the saying goes, a kind of blank check to do what he wishes in Southeast Asia with minimal opposition. If you look at the vote, it's overwhelming in both parties. But that's a little misleading because, in fact, if you listen to the debate, if you watch what lawmakers really in both parties, especially Democrats, but what they're actually saying, it's clear that they have doubts, not so much about what happened in the Gulf. What they doubt is that Vietnam is worth the price of a large war, and I think they doubt that the South Vietnamese government will do what they have to do. I think Lyndon Johnson and his advisors have decided quietly to embark on an escalation of U.S. involvement. I think they enter 1965 with that basic position.
At this point, there's also an increasing military pressure from not only the National Liberation Front, but also from the North Vietnamese Army, which is infiltrating through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ultimately, President Johnson decides that they have to intervene militarily, and the decision is made to start with air power.
One early morning in March 1965, Dr. Quat called me on the phone, "Come to my place right away. There are some important things."
The setbacks, both politically in South Vietnam, where there is continuing political turmoil in Saigon, the increased brazenness and willingness of the Viet Cong to launch attacks, the degree to which American advisors are increasingly vulnerable themselves to being attacked, all of this feeds a growing sense that we're at a crossroads here.
And Dr. Quat said to me that there are 3 Marine battalions from the American landing in Da Nang. I was surprised. How come that it comes so suddenly like that? The military situation, well, of course, is very dangerous. But how come this very sudden development like that?
I think the lack of communication between not only the White House and the government of South Vietnam, but also the military command and the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff and the U.S. Embassy has a lot to do with a lack of trust. I think ultimately there is a sense that South Vietnam is an ally, but there very much is a senior subordinate relationship there.
With regard to Operation Rolling Thunder, Johnson and the White House wanted to incrementally raise the bombing so at some particular point, rational people would decide that they didn't want to prosecute the war in the South. The only problem is that they did not get to define rationality on the part of North Vietnam. The White House imposed so many restrictions that it really achieved nothing other than putting those air crews at risk.
Operation Rolling Thunder was a mistake because it did not take into account the psychology of the North Vietnamese and the fact that the North Vietnamese communists controlled all information going to their population. So they explained the bombing as an obvious attempt by the U.S. to take over control and act just as the French had acted many years before. And that was all the motivation that was needed to raise thousands and thousands of volunteers to both repair the bombing and to go south.
There were dissenting voices in the American government, there's no question about it, and in Congress. The Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey, says, I don't think we can win this thing, and I don't think it's necessary for us to win it.
First he started bombing the North, and then when it looked like South Vietnam was going to fall, regardless of his bombing, he began to send troops into South Vietnam. Before this happened, my family thought the communists were going to win, and they and a lot of people in the middle class in Saigon were thinking of fleeing again. When LBJ sent troops in, it's like, they saved us at the last moment. The middle class in Saigon was very, very happy.
I think it's worth saying that as Johnson fully Americanizes the struggle, he is determined to keep that as low visibility as he can.
I have today ordered to Vietnam the Air Mobile Division and certain other forces which will raise our fighting strength from 75,000 to 125,000 men almost immediately.
So he announces a large-scale escalation in a quiet way, if you will. He refuses the urgings of some advisors to call up the reserves, to put the nation fully on a war footing. He's not going to do it.
My father told me, we're so lucky. We're such a small, poor country. We had nothing to offer the United States, and yet it's sending troops, giving us not only resources, but saving us with their own lives. We thought with the Americans coming in, there was no way the communists could win.
The plane lands in Da Nang, the door opens, and this heat rolls in, this incredible heat rolls in, which is a lot hotter than any place I'd been prior to then. And you're exiting the plane, and there's a row of troops leaving and a row of troops arriving. And the difference between the way we looked coming off and the way these other guys looked coming on pretty much underscored that, you didn't really realize what you're getting into, because these guys look very different, right? They look very different. These guys had jungle uniforms, and they'd been out in the bush for, a year, and it showed. You could certainly see that they'd experienced something. Something had changed these guys.
The U.S., they have all kind of, support. That time, they have a very good tank they call the M48. Nothing can hurt that tank. But aside that, they can use a bulldozer. They knock all the bobby trap and mine and everything down and to reduce the casualty. The Vietnamese too have a lot of casualty because we don't have that kind of heavy equipment. I believe the Americans are gonna win the war very easily because that kind of support, that kind of troop, and that kind of power. So I don't know why the war keep continue.
Marvin units, they weren't as well equipped as we were. You'd see these guys with a lot of World War II surplus weapons still carrying M1s and Thompsons and just not up to speed.
The military campaign, which ostensibly is trying to defeat the insurgency, is actually having a negative impact on the population because they're blaming the Americans for all the damage that's being wrought on the countryside. So I think that was part of the problem that you saw from a quantitative approach that folks like McNamara and others tried to place on top of a war that was much more about legitimacy and loyalty and relationships.
You can't do it by body count. That's not how you win a war. Right? You win a war by, making the enemy unable to continue, not by killing their people.
You cannot kill your way to victory in an insurgency. You go into a village, even one that's basically sympathetic with the government, and you fire on some American helicopters, and they fire back and kill villagers, and you just converted that village. The Viet Cong very quickly realized this was a great recruiting tool.
Life is turned upside down for us, and even younger like myself, we had to take a part of the war, and we fought against American, against the South Vietnamese, even though it's a lot of dead and wounded in our country. And so for them to stay and fight, that is only choice.
And the military does not build nations, The military kills people. Right, and it destroys things. It blows things up and it kills people.
Americans come in, we have to run and hide in a bunker. We try to be friendly, but when we're shaking, we're so scared and run around and somebody else die. For Americans, see, Viet Cong is an enemy, it's an evil. To us, they're the Vietnamese. They are people. They are the villagers.
That tension between trying to build a South Vietnamese political community, or assist with that, and at the same time fight a war that was causing depopulation, that was causing great tragedy across the South Vietnamese landscape, that helped undermine what was a very comprehensive strategy. And all that had to be taken into account as you're trying to maintain support not only from the American home front, but also from the South Vietnamese home front, and also demonstrate that you're making progress.
The anti-war movement had kind of gone through what I think of as being a period where folks in the movement thought, well, we can just convince our leaders that there's been a mistake, that this was a terrible idea, and if they knew everything we knew, they would realize the errors of their ways. But that wasn't working. It was clear to them that the government knew full well what was happening and that they intended to pursue this war. And so by 1967, the movement took on a more radical turn. This was the period in which folks were trying to, stop the war by any means necessary. It was the year that they tried to levitate the Pentagon. It was the year that the resistance, the draft card burning and the draft resistance got started.
The staging area was usually Lafayette Park across from the White House, and I would, for a large demonstration, generally go out in front with a walkie-talkie and direct attention to particular areas if a large number were massing in a particular area. And of course, the residual fear would be that there would be some storming of the White House itself. It was even suggested at one time that we should electrify the fence, and I thought that was a supremely terrible idea, and it did not go forward. There were chants outside, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? And we could hear it. We could hear it in the West Wing, and the president could hear it in the Oval Office. Even when nothing more was happening, it was just present all the time.
In late 67, as Johnson is insisting on good news being presented to the American people, General Westmoreland says, "We have reached an important moment when the end begins to come into view."
The enemy cannot win now in Vietnam.
Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese are planning what becomes known as the Tet Offensive, in which massive series of attacks throughout South Vietnam, designed to ultimately topple the South Vietnamese government, to cause an uprising on the part of the populace, and to end the war on communist terms.
Laizwan believed that by simultaneously attacking the cities and towns across South Vietnam with main force units, that it would be powerful enough to inspire the masses to rise up and topple the Saigon regime once and for all. So this was how, Vietnamese communist troops would win in short order. Ho Chi Minh and General Giap did not believe that, this strategy should be implemented at the time in the manner that Laizwan saw fit. They always believed that, Laizwan's strategy was always just too risky, and it risked losing all the gains made at that point by the Communist Army. So that was the disagreement in 1967. Laizwan, using the powers of his police state, arrested all of his enemies. All of this was to send a signal, send a sign to Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, who could not be arrested, to sort of quit their opposition to Laizwan's decisions and his strategy. Laizwan prevailed.
The North Vietnamese are pretty smart. They launch a preliminary attack at Khe Sanh on January 21st, even while, basically 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong are positioning themselves for what becomes the Tet Offensive.
I went to Khe Sanh in December, right? On the 20th of January is when, all hell broke loose. And they attacked both 861 and the base in full strength with this enormous artillery barrage. Cut the road and basically cut the base off. The actual, quote, siege was about 2 months. I think there were roughly 6,000 Marines at the base, and there were roughly 40,000 in VA surrounding us. They had this enormous advantage in terms of artillery and so forth. And they were just slamming the base every day. The advantage we had that, say, for example, the French didn't have at Dien Bien Phu was air power. As the siege went on and the weather got better, right, air power just decimated these guys.
When the communists launched a countrywide attack called the Tet Offensive in 1968, the Americans launched a ferocious counterattack and drove the communists from all the cities and towns they had occupied.
Tet had an enormous psychological effect, more of a psychological effect than a military effect.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion.
Johnson said something to the effect of, if we've lost Walter Cronkite, we've lost the country.
The message of the Tet Offensive to the American administration and to the American people is, yes, unless you continue, not only continue at this level, but unless you sink more into this war, you're not going to win. So there was two different perceptions, really, in Vietnam and in the United States.
March was a very dramatic month. Clark Clifford, when he became Secretary of Defense, was one of the two men who were deeply involved and really led that effort to push the president to reconsider some of these positions. The other was my great friend and colleague Harry McPherson, who was then the chief speechwriter for the president. Clifford was asked to report on his trip to Vietnam. He said, we have three alternatives. One is to extend our troop commitment to roughly 1 million men. No one wanted to do that. The second was to concentrate our troops in highly populated other critical areas. Nobody wanted to do that. And the third is to begin a staged withdrawal. Clifford was doing an adroit lawyer's trick, really, was to put on the table this issue, and he did it in the context of two obviously unattractive options, leaving only withdrawal. Harry wrote, at the president's request, a Hawkey speech and a Dovey speech. For a while, the president was working with the Hawkey speech, and then he called and said, now make these additions to speech B, which was the Dovey speech, and Harry called Clark Clifford and said, we have prevailed.
Tet represented a defeat for Lyndon Johnson. In the aftermath of Tet, he comes to a decision that, just as he feared, Vietnam has been his undoing. Just as he feared, he is politically defeated in many respects. And he makes the decision that he's not going to run for re-election in 1968.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Nixon was elected in the '68 election, sort of intimating that he had a secret plan to end the war.
The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker.
In fact, he didn't have a secret plan. He had some amorphous ideas about how to withdraw from Vietnam, but he's still involved in the Cold War and can't afford just to, basically, as Kissinger says, to pick up everything and come home. So the idea becomes, how do you disengage in Vietnam and still give South Vietnam a reasonable chance of surviving after you're gone? And the answer was Vietnamization.
As I announced on Tuesday, by December 15th, our troop strength in Vietnam will have been reduced by a minimum of 60,000 men.
That was essentially improve the capacity of the South Vietnamese to defend themselves while withdrawing U.S. troops, and at some particular point, they stand up and we stand down.
When President Nixon came into power, even though he was withdrawing American troops, he was also fighting very hard to weaken the communists. We thought Nixon was a tough candidate. We were reassured by his belligerence.
Hell no, we won't go. Hell no, we won't go. End the war. End the war.
We wanted to end the war. We wanted to bring the American soldiers home. We didn't want to have any more dead American boys.
1969 was a critical time in the anti-war movement. There had just been this very popular, very broad participatory moratorium on October 15th, which had involved 3 million people across the country in all forms of anti-war protest, including what some people described as a general strike. I mean, lots of workplaces had closed down for the day or part of the day. Tens of thousands of students didn't show up. So the moratorium had happened, and on November 15th was an incredibly large anti-war demonstration as well.
I helped organize busloads of people from Pittsburgh and western Pennsylvania and even parts of northern West Virginia.
I sort of ran the stage and Peter Yarrow ran the music, and it was a marvelous, marvelous turnout.
This was just overwhelming. I mean, I couldn't even imagine, an ocean of people. I remember speakers, I remember music, I remember moving around and marching. I remember a lot of security overhead in helicopters and police presence, especially protecting the White House.
And the word was, end the war in Vietnam now, bring the troops home, and lots of wonderful people came. Coretta Scott King was the co-chair with Bill Coffin, Reverend William Sloane Coffin, and she also participated in the March Against Death the night before, where Americans marching held the names of dead American soldiers.
In November 1969, Richard Nixon made a speech that's come to be known as the silent majority speech. And in it, he made an appeal to what he described as the silent majority of Americans. They were the people who were not out in the streets protesting, who did not have their voices being heard. And he needed their support in order to negotiate successfully with the Vietnamese.
And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support
I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace. I have initiated a plan of action which will enable me to keep that pledge.
On the one hand, he said, we can have this path towards peace, but on the other hand, we don't want to lose. And in order for that to happen, I need you, the silent majority of Americans. After that speech, a majority who polled saying that they sympathized with Nixon, and only a large but a minority of folks saying that they were kind of with the protesters.
Behind the scenes, I think you see a Nixon that has come to see Vietnam as an example of the limitations of American policy. And when he does articulate what will become known as the Nixon Doctrine, I think that doctrine is in fact an admission that there are limits to American power.
We shall furnish military and economic assistance when requested in accordance with our treaty commitments. But we shall look to the nation directly threatened to assume the primary responsibility of providing the manpower.
And in that sense, it is necessary for the United States to withdraw from Vietnam so Nixon and Kissinger can rethink the structure of the Cold War and relationships not only between the United States and Russia, but also with China, and I think ultimately with the rest of the world.
We take this action not for the purpose of expanding the war into Cambodia, but for the purpose of ending the war in Vietnam and winning the just peace we all desire.
Let's talk about President Nixon. He knew he must end the war just because of the pressure of the politics in this country. So early 1970, he gave order attack to Cambodia because the communist central headquarters, they locate along the border, they command the war in Vietnam. But they are very safe because the U.S. troops and Vietnamese troops never, invade over there.
Throughout the entire American experience in Vietnam, there is a constant concern that the Americans are fighting the war with one hand tied behind their backs, that North Vietnam is allowed to work through these neutral countries of Laos and Cambodia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail weaves its way through both of those countries and is a major artery in terms of moving supplies and manpower down this trail into South Vietnam. And so after a secret bombing, which occurs in 1969 to hopefully hit and disrupt the North Vietnamese sanctuaries, Nixon agrees to a cross-border operation in the spring of 1970.
Here we are trying to stop this war, and it's escalating. That was traumatic. I mean, I remember watching it on TV. He was showing us, he had a map there showing us the Ho Chi Minh Trail that was going through Cambodia, and this is why we have to interdict and, invade and bomb the people of Cambodia, and this is, all because of the Soviet expansion and the weapons that the enemy of the North is coming in the South. I mean, just pure lies.
The announcement on April 30th of the invasion of Cambodia completely shocked the country and galvanized an anti-war movement that had actually been in some state of confusion and disarray for the preceding few months. There were protests all across the college campuses, and very famously and tragically, there were 4 students at Kent State who were killed by National Guardsmen in their protests against the war.
I sort of felt like, gosh, this is just getting worse and just getting worse. And then what happens on May 4th is just, it was very, 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 very hard and very, very tough. I wasn't sure if this war was ever going to end.
The mayor of New York, John Lindsay, had called for a day of remembrance for the Kent State 4. So there were about 200 anti-war protesters gathered outside of the stock exchange at Wall Street. A number of construction workers attacked the anti-war protesters. Around 70 people were injured. The Nixon administration pounced on it, associating themselves with the hard hat demonstrations and valorizing the actions of the hard hat construction workers. Nixon had spent the preceding 2 years depicting the anti-war movement as elite, as impudent snobs, as taking daddy's money, and also as being unpatriotic, rabble-rousers, and that helped bolster Nixon's credibility. In fact, it was after the Hard Hat riots that the first labor movement anti-war protest was held.
The fact that we've been involved in Vietnam didn't mean that we were particularly supporting the war. Right? You know, we just got swept up in it. The old cliche about people who hate war the most are the people who've been in war is probably true.
There was a lot of class resentment, a feeling that these entitled protesters were shutting down the colleges, burning buildings, you know, creating havoc. So there was an anger at the protesters, not necessarily support for the war. In fact, some people said, well, I think the war is a terrible thing, but these protesters are awful.
I think I got arrested 14 times in various cities for protests against the war. The first time I spent a week in jail was in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1970. We blocked the driveway to Nixon's White House. I'd wake up with a sweat every morning. I was afraid to take showers. I had 2 friends who were raped in the jail. I had 1 friend who got a lead bar cracked across his head. We fasted the entire time. I didn't eat at all either. So it was a traumatic experience, a scary experience.
When we were being briefed in Okinawa on our return back to the United States, they told us not to wear our uniforms when we got home. I mean, I was a Marine. I was very proud of being in the Marine Corps. And decorations aside, you know, I mean, it's just, this is my life. This is what I've been doing. And you're telling me it's not valuable, it's not worth it, that somehow I should, you know, hide it. It was very uncomfortable. You know, I think that the anti-war movement here in this country had a huge impact politically on ending the war, you know, and I kind of applaud them for that. But I think deep down inside, I can never forgive them for the way they treated the troops.
A lot of people say that the anti-war movement spit on the soldiers when they came home, when we have only found 1 instance of that, and even that person regrets having done it. And that gets fabricated into how the peace movement was so unpatriotic and how the peace movement was so insensitive to the military. So one part of this story that I would like to get told is that it's patriotic to be against war, even if you can only right now think that it's patriotic to be in the military. Just because we care about people in other cultures and we care about our own military and our own soldiers, we care so much about the soldiers, we don't want them to go fight wars.
There were 2 sets of talks. There were the public plenary sessions that took place between all 4 sides involved in the war. There were secret bilateral talks that took place between only the United States and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. So the South Vietnamese parties were not present, but it was their fate that was being decided. Both sides really did not want to conclude a settlement until they scored a major military victory.
I was not prepared, and most people were not, for the Easter Offensive, because it was the largest action since the Tet Offensive. There were 3 major attacks at Quang Tri and Kon Tum and An Loc. It involved 130,000 troops. They attacked An Loc with tanks, and tanks had never been seen that far south before. And so the intensity of that battle surprised everybody.
Le Duan was hoping that his strategy would bring Vietnamese Communist forces to victory in a very, very difficult time, because you just had, you know, sort of major announcements that Nixon was going to visit China and visit the Soviet Union, the first time that an American president would visit either of those 2 countries. This had a devastating impact on the North Vietnamese leadership, and they launched that spring-summer offensive right in between the Beijing and the Moscow summits. The 1972 Spring-Summer Offensive was an offensive that once again showcased Le Duan's desire to push forward his general offensive, general uprising in a different incarnation. He thought that the window of opportunity arose once again to topple the Saigon regime.
About 4,500 R.O.V.E.R.S were surrounded by 30,000 North Vietnamese and under siege. So essentially we lived in bunkers. We took artillery from the enemy on a regular basis, day in and day out. And mostly what the advisors did was to put in airstrikes.
In 1972, they tried to attack us without the U.S. troops. But we handled them well. just because the U.S. support, they still have a supporting like airplane B-52, and also some Navy from the outside support. So we need just support, no ground troop. We win that, and we control our country well.
In a very real sense, the Vietnamese won a great victory in '72, and in fact, Nixon declares Vietnamization a success. But parenthetically, they were a success with massive amounts of U.S. support.
The effect of the failure of that offensive to topple the Saigon regime and to also derail this sort of great power collusion was that Le Duan finally had to turn to the diplomatic sphere and negotiations. Le Duan had always believed that the sort of puppet collapse was intimately tied and connected to American withdrawal. So if the two governments could be overthrown, then the Americans would inevitably have to withdraw. Following the Easter offensive, then Le Duan starts changing his tune and he wants to focus on negotiating the Americans out. That's what Ho Chi Minh had wanted his whole life, is to just deal with the Americans first and then turn to the enemy in Saigon and vanquishing them at a later point.
In the aftermath of the '72 fighting, both sides made significant concessions. American concession was that we had been insisting all through the war that the condition of any peace agreement had to be that North Vietnamese troops would withdraw. And we dropped that. The Vietnamese side had been insisting for all those years that we would have to oust President Thieu and dismantle his government and create a so-called government of national unity. And they dropped that demand. And over the next month or so, Kissinger and Thaw completed an agreement, which was accepted by both sides, down to the final word. The South Vietnamese government was excluded from those negotiations. They had some inklings about what was going on, but they were not included. After this draft was concluded and a signing date was set, Kissinger went to Saigon to get President Thieu to sign on.
What Kissinger didn't know when he arrived in Saigon in the fall of 1972 with this draft agreement was that the South Vietnamese had already acquired a copy, and they didn't agree with many different aspects of that draft agreement. The South Vietnamese government believed that Kissinger was duped by the North Vietnamese negotiators. Thieu's handwritten notes, his angry notes, which calls Kissinger every bad name that he could think of in 3 different languages, sort of foreshadows the death of this draft agreement and how there would not be peace in 1972.
Kissinger then went back, and in effect, he backed out of the agreement that he had already signed on to. And we resumed negotiations to try to meet the South Vietnamese objections. When the renegotiation broke down in December, Kissinger and Nixon decided to resume bombing North Vietnam and carry out these heavy raids in and around Hanoi and Haiphong. And that was what became known as the Christmas bombing.
Vietnamese communists called this 12 days of darkness because the skies were darkened by all the bombs that fell. This was, B-52 raids that just fell continuously over North Vietnam.
And a few days after that, a new agreement was reached, which differed in no significant way from the agreement that had already been reached in October. The claim that the bombing forced the North Vietnamese into accepting a peace agreement this is not just speculation or logic, it's proved. You can read both those documents and you can see that they amounted to the same thing. So they didn't sign anything in January that they weren't willing to sign in October before that bombing took place. But Thieu came around.
Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia. In the settlement that has now been agreed to, all the conditions that I laid down then have been met. A ceasefire, internationally supervised, will begin at 7 p.m. this Saturday, January 27, Washington time.
The peace agreement had 2 parts. It called for a ceasefire in place, and both sides were supposed to stop shooting, and then a political process to occur leading to elections that would supposedly create a new government in South Vietnam that would then make whatever arrangement it could make with North Vietnam. Neither side respected the ceasefire. Neither side ever made a single move to implement the political provisions.
When the Paris Peace Accords are signed with a ceasefire in place, it leaves all of those North Vietnamese troops who were not destroyed in the Eastern Offensive still in South Vietnam. And to me, that was essentially a death warrant eventually for South Vietnam.
Within 60 days from this Saturday, all Americans held prisoners of war throughout Indochina will be released. There will be the fullest possible accounting for all of those who are missing in action. During the same 60-day period, all American forces will be withdrawn from South Vietnam.
By March 73, all U.S. troops are gone, with the exception of about 60 military in the Defense Attaché office. The South Vietnamese are on their own. As Tu says, a third Indochina war starts. And so the South Vietnamese do very well in 1973, and a lot of heavy fighting. 1973 was the third highest year for South Vietnamese killed in action.
My family was pretty hopeful. The South Vietnamese army was strong. The Americans had equipped it, and they thought that the South Vietnamese army could hold out for a while if the Americans continued to give us economic and military aid and keep supporting the troops with bombing.
When we stopped bombing in 73, stopped bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail, North Vietnam runs all that material and equipment and replacements down the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Before the agreement, if one soldier, they want to infiltrate from North Vietnam to the south, it took him 6 to 9 months. After the Paris Agreement, they take them only 3 days. Now they can go a battalion, regiment, they take Molotov all the way to the border and they come to the Vietnam, because at that time no more B-52, no more airplane, no more reconnaissance, no more aerial photo.
After the Americans pulled out completely, the economy began to crumble because jobs disappeared. You know, the whole country was supporting 500,000 American soldiers, right? When they left, a lot of the jobs went with them. There was war in the Middle East and an oil embargo. Inflation was very high. The government was very corrupt and inefficient. Students were out in the street protesting. General Thiel, who had become head of the country by that time, was extremely unpopular.
The system was incurably corrupt. The whole government structure in South Vietnam was a military structure. Promotions were for sale. The military used its power to extort money in every way they possibly could and pass it on up the line.
In mid-74, they began to run into problems. Nixon is embroiled in Watergate.
The time has come for me to speak out about the charges made and to provide a perspective on the issue for the American people.
Dealing with a very confronting Congress, U.S. military aid is reduced, and essentially the South Vietnamese began then to feel the squeeze. By mid-74, they're rationing artillery rounds, they're rationing grenades. As time goes along in 74, of course, Nixon, who made 31 promises that the United States would be there for South Vietnam, in early August finds himself out of office and disgraced.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Nixon essentially said, we will be there like we were in 72. And Tu believes that to the last minute, despite evidence to the contrary.
In 1974, Congress voted to cut aid. The military had proposed $1 billion or $1 billion plus in military aid for South Vietnam, and Congress cut that back to $700 million. So a significant reduction, but there was never a cutoff. People sort of attribute this to the left wing, the peaceniks, and that movement had no influence. And what had really changed in politics was that once American soldiers weren't there, the American public didn't really care what happened to Vietnam.
My parents always had this fear that in the end the communists would win. The Americans only gave them hope as long as they were there. But now, with the Americans gone, the whole country, sunken into this despair, they began to feel afraid. In 1975, the communists decided to launch an offensive, hoping that they could end the war and defeat the South Vietnamese government.
My family lived in a small town called Ban Ma Thuột in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, which had the distinction in March 1975 of being the first town overrun by communist invasion. My brother was 10, I was 4, and my mother had to make a life and death decision, and the path that she chose was to flee that town with my brother and me, and we walked, I think, 184 kilometers downhill to the nearest port city, which was Nha Trang. We were lucky to actually get on a boat to get to Saigon, where we found our father.
You have to remember, this was an enormous human tragedy. A couple of million Vietnamese were fleeing from the communist forces, evacuating families of soldiers under terrible, terrible conditions.
And a month later, the communists arrived in Saigon as well. And we were lucky again to catch another boat out of Saigon and make it to Guam.
The communists thought it would take them into 1976 to take over the country. But in 1975, like a few weeks later, they were outside Saigon. And they were setting up the barrage. They were going to shell it and then take it over.
I was a man during the last day of South Vietnam to go to Washington to plead for an emergency aid of 700 million. But the Congress refused.
President Ford went on television. He presented to Congress another supplemental request for $722 million. This was in the middle of April. No one could possibly have believed that any of that aid was really ever going to get to South Vietnam in time. By then, the end was inevitable. And even the defenders of it, most of them didn't say, we're going to save South Vietnam. Most of them said, this is to save America's reputation.
I used to say it was not a good page in the history of the American by then. They refused to give South Vietnam a few $100 million, while in the same time the Soviet Union and China, they added the North Vietnamese with their tanks and with the whole equipment to invade South Vietnam by then.
I just felt this immense sense of impending tragedy. I knew that if the North Vietnamese took over, the results were going to be horrendous.
When the Americans started playing that song, White Christmas, then they knew that that was a signal for the Americans to get to their evacuation points, and the country was about to fall.
One night, an American who spoke fluent Vietnamese called my brother and said, you can leave the country, but you only have until tomorrow afternoon at 1 p.m. to get out. Bus picked them up and took them to the airport. That was April 29th, the day before the communists came in. Rockets were beginning to fall. The communists were starting to shell. So they thought they were going to die there. And then suddenly, early in the morning of April 30th, they looked up and they saw these big choppers coming in and landing.
All of us had sort of felt like this war was going to go on forever. You know, that neither side was strong enough to win or weak enough to lose.
When the French were defeated, at least there was this climactic battle at Dien Bien Phu, you know. But Saigon just fell, just like a ripe fruit, you know, it just fell.
I was in a really, really deep depression for weeks following that, because it just made everything I'd done just suspect, you know. What was this all for if we're just going to walk away?
A number of my friends died either in prison or in concentration camps. Some of them escaped by boats in kind of hejiras that you could only imagine.
I didn't care who won. I didn't care who lost. I only cared that the war ended and that Vietnam now experienced peace, and that the country is once again united.
We are not very happy with the American attitude about how they disengaged from South Vietnam, you see. I have to add it, and it is a very important too, that it was in many ways compensated by the welcome that the American people welcomed the Vietnamese refugees who came to this country. They thank the American people for this welcome, because they leave us free men now here in the U.S. They have their families, they have their children. The children go to school, to college, and it is quite a successful community of Vietnamese right now in the U.S. And we thank the American people for that.